Keanu Reeves trusted his best friend with his most personal project, until the day he discovered it had been stolen and sold to Hollywood's most ruthless studio. Everyone expected revenge. But Keanu's quiet response stunned the world and revealed a secret he had kept hidden for decades. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was the summer of 1999. Keanu Reeves was fresh off the success of The Matrix, but that wasn't where his story truly began. Before the bright lights, the fame, and the whispers of Hollywood legend, there was a young man with a quiet heart, searching for meaning through his craft. On the dusty backlot of an indie film no one remembers today, Keanu first met Daniel Cross. Daniel was everything Keanu was not: loud, confident, and brimming with charisma. Where Keanu found solace in silence, Daniel filled every space with energy. They were opposites in every way, yet from their very first conversation, it was clear they understood each other. They bonded over late-night coffee runs and long talks about films that mattered. Not the blockbusters that raked in millions, but the ones that whispered truths about life, loss, and redemption. They were both just struggling actors back then, waiting for callbacks, living paycheck to paycheck, yet dreaming bigger than their circumstances allowed. Daniel had grown up hard, moving through foster homes, teaching himself to survive. Keanu, with his own share of grief from losing loved ones far too soon, recognized the loneliness in Daniel's eyes. And so, Keanu opened his world to him. When Daniel couldn't pay rent, Keanu covered it. When Daniel's car broke down on a night he was supposed to make a crucial audition, Keanu drove him there. And when Daniel confessed that he sometimes doubted he belonged in Hollywood at all, Keanu sat with him in silence, offering presence when words weren't enough. As years passed, they became more than friends. They were brothers in everything but blood. They rose through the ranks together, Daniel landing roles in gritty dramas, while Keanu became a global icon. Yet no matter how far they climbed, their connection remained grounded in something deeper than success. They shared a dream, not of fame or fortune, but of telling a story that mattered. That story was Shattered Light. Keanu had first conceived the idea in his late 20s, scribbling notes in worn journals between filming days. Shattered Light was personal in a way none of his previous projects had been. It was the story of a man broken by grief, finding hope in the most unexpected places. It mirrored Keanu's own losses, his best friend River Phoenix, his unborn daughter, and later, his partner Jennifer Syme. The pain he carried in silence found its voice in Shattered Light. For years he kept the project close, unsure if he was ready to share it with the world. But Daniel understood it in a way no one else did. "You need to make this," Danielle had told him one night, the script pages spread out on the coffee table between them. They were sitting in Keanu's modest house in the Hollywood Hills, a world away from the glitz that surrounded them. "This isn't just a movie, man. This is your soul on paper." Keanu hesitated. "I don't think I can do it alone." Daniel's answer came without pause. "Then you won't." And so, they became co-creators of Shattered Light. Daniel would direct, Keanu would star. They would co-write, drawing from endless conversations about life and loss, hope and redemption. It wasn't just a film to them, it was a promise. A promise to stay true to something bigger than either of them. They worked late into the nights, hashing out scenes, debating over dialogue, pushing each other to dig deeper. Keanu trusted Daniel completely, trusted him not just with the words, but with his truth. Daniel had always said he was in it for the right reasons, that this story was bigger than any paycheck, any award season, any studio approval. For Keanu, it wasn't about money. It never was. He had quietly given away millions, supported charities, and refused the trappings of celebrity life. Shattered Light was different. It was his healing. his chance to honor the people he'd lost, and he believed Daniel was the only person who could help him bring it to life. Their bond was unbreakable, or so Keanu thought. As the project gained momentum, Daniel took on more responsibility. He met with potential investors, scouted locations, and began assembling a small team of creatives they both trusted. Keanu, who had always been more comfortable in the shadows of Hollywood, allowed Daniel to take the lead in negotiations. It was a role Daniel seemed born for. He knew how to talk to people, how to sell the dream without selling out, or at least, that's what Keanu believed. And when Daniel assured him that every decision was about protecting the integrity of the project, Keanu believed him. How could he not? This was the man who had been there through every season of his life, through the silence after River's death, through the quiet grief of losing Jennifer and their child, through the lonely nights when Keanu questioned if there was any point in carrying on. Daniel had been there, and Keanu had never doubted him, not once, until the day he had to. But that's not where their story begins. It begins here, with two young men sitting on the roof of a crumbling apartment building, sharing dreams under a blanket of stars, brothers in spirit, partners in hope, and the belief that, together, they could create something that mattered. What they didn't know then was how fragile even the strongest bonds could be, and how betrayal often comes from those we trust the most. It was supposed to be the final piece. Keanu Reeves stood on location in Kyoto, Japan, filming a quiet, thoughtful drama about a wandering poet searching for peace. It was the kind of project Keanu loved. Small, personal, and meaningful. Between takes, he often found himself thinking of shattered light. He and Daniel had agreed they would return to Los Angeles in 2 months and finally begin shooting their passion project. It had taken years to get to this point. The script was complete, funding secured, a small, dedicated crew ready to go. Keanu couldn't wait. This film meant more than any role he had ever played. It was his story, his heart on the screen. And then the phone rang. His longtime manager, Lucas Gray, never called unless it was important, but this call wasn't important. It was devastating. "Keanu," Lucas's voice was tight. "You need to sit down." Keanu's heart didn't speed up. If anything, it slowed. He listened in silence as Lucas explained what had happened. Daniel Cross had sold Shattered Light to Iron Tower Studios. Keanu barely heard the words. "They bought the script outright," Lucas said, his voice steadying as if rehearsed. "They're moving fast. Production has already begun." That didn't make sense. Keanu had trusted Daniel with the rights, the legal filings. They were partners. He was sure of it. And then Lucas said the thing that made the world tilt. "Daniel's listed as the sole creator, writer, and director. Your name isn't anywhere." Silence. The kind of silence that felt louder than any explosion. Keanu stood there, the Kyoto breeze tugging gently at his jacket, but he didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything at all. Lucas kept talking. "The studio's PR machine is in full swing. They're calling it Daniel's personal masterpiece, based on his life story. And Keanu," there was hesitation, "they're saying, you have nothing to do with it." For a moment, Keanu thought it had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. He and Daniel had known each other for more than 2 decades. He had trusted Daniel with his deepest truths. Daniel had cried with him as they wrote scenes that bled Keanu's real life into every page. And now it was gone. Worse, it had been stolen and twisted. Lucas was still speaking. "They're rewriting the script, adding explosions, a love triangle. Iron Tower is turning Shattered Light into something else entirely." Keanu closed his eyes. He could see it already. His story, the one born from grief and hope, now a hollow blockbuster. Loud, shallow, exploitative. And Daniel? Daniel was the one doing it. Lucas added, "I'm sending you everything we've gathered, contracts, press releases. We're putting together a legal strategy, but Keanu, you have to come back." Keanu didn't respond. Not yet. He ended the call, pocketed his phone, and quietly walked away from the set. That night, Keanu sat in his hotel room, staring at the same journal where he'd first sketched the outline for Shattered Light. The pages were filled with his handwriting. Private. Honest. They had never been meant for anyone else. But he'd shared them with Daniel, trusting him, believing in him. He ran a hand over the pages, wondering at the weight of that trust, wondering how it had become a weapon. The news broke like wildfire the next day. Daniel Cross's Shattered Light set to redefine cinema, one headline read. Another, the personal story behind Daniel Cross's visionary film. There were whispers in the industry too, whispers that Keanu had been pushed aside, that Daniel had cut him out, that Keanu Reeves, the humble movie star who gave away most of his earnings to crew members and charities, had been betrayed in the worst possible way. Keanu's team went into crisis mode. File the lawsuit, Lucas insisted. We have enough to crush them. Others called for a press conference. You need to speak out, said Mira Torres, his publicist. If you stay silent, they'll control the narrative. Daniel will control the story. But Keanu didn't say a word. He left Japan 2 days later, skipping the wrap party, slipping quietly onto a private flight to Los Angeles. No one knew where he went after he landed, not even Lucas. For 2 weeks, Keanu disappeared. The media speculated wildly. Keanu Reeves, shattered by betrayal, read one tabloid. Is Keanu done with Hollywood? Asked another. Photos surfaced of Daniel Cross smiling on red carpets, shaking hands with studio executives, claiming in interviews that Shattered Light was his passion project, his life story. And Keanu's name was never mentioned. The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was total. Iron Tower Studios wasted no time. They rewrote entire sections of the script, hiring action writers to punch up the dialogue, add more spectacle. They recast the lead role, choosing a young, flashy actor with box office draw, but no understanding of the story's heart. The scenes Keanu had written, from his own grief, the quiet moments of a man searching for forgiveness, struggling to find hope, were replaced with gunfights and high-speed chases. The title stayed the same, Shattered Light, but everything else had been stripped away. Industry insiders whispered that Keanu had been naive to trust Daniel, that he was finished. Reeves is old news, one anonymous executive said in a trade magazine. The industry's moved on. Even Daniel's statements hinted at Keanu's irrelevance. I'm grateful for everyone who helped me get to this point, he said at a press conference, but this vision was always mine. When the first teaser trailer for Shattered Light dropped online, it was exactly what Keanu had feared. A slow magnition explosion, a synth-heavy soundtrack, a tagline that read, "Some lights can't be shattered." It was a spectacle, and it had nothing to do with truth. Lucas and Mira met daily with Keanu's legal team, drawing up paperwork, collecting evidence, preparing to go to war. But Keanu didn't He had disappeared again. His charities called to say they hadn't heard from him. The staff at his motorcycle company said he hadn't been to the shop in weeks. He stopped returning calls, stopped replying to texts. For a man who had already suffered so much in his life, it was as if this final betrayal had quietly broken something inside him. His closest friends, the ones who had stood by him through everything, said they had never seen Keanu like this. Not after River's death. Not after losing Jennifer and their baby. This was different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was silent. Weeks passed. Iron Tower moved forward with production, releasing behind-the-scenes footage, hyping the film at festivals. Daniel Cross stood on every stage, shaking every hand, smiling for every camera. And Keanu faded from sight. No lawsuits were filed. No statements were made. He said nothing. And to the world, it seemed like he had given up. But what no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that Keanu was planning something no one saw coming. And when he finally did act, it would leave everyone speechless. The story hit the headlines like wildfire. Keanu Reeves, betrayed by his best friend. Hollywood's quiet hero double-crossed. Daniel Cross steals Reeves' life work. Within hours of the news breaking, the media frenzy began. Paparazzi camped outside Keanu Reeves' home in the Hollywood Hills. They parked vans across the street, lenses aimed at his gates, hoping for even a glimpse of the reclusive star. But there was nothing. Keanu's curtains stayed drawn, the gate never opened. Fans flooded social media. Justice for Keanu trended globally. Support poured in from actors, directors, and even political figures. Messages of sympathy, outrage, and confusion filled the internet. But Keanu said nothing. He stayed hidden away, not in shame, but in thought. And the world noticed. Daniel Cross, however, was everywhere. He smiled at the camera in expensive suits, gracing magazine covers and late-night talk shows. On the Prime show, he chuckled when the host asked about Keanu. "We're still friends," Daniel said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Keanu made his choice to walk away. I just finished the journey." The audience clapped. But not everyone was clapping. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu's closest friends watched the interviews in silence, faces tense. Fiona Carrington was among them. Fiona, who had worked alongside Keanu in humanitarian efforts, who had written books about leadership and courage. She had stood beside him during his quiet battles. She knew the truth about the man who had carried so much loss and given so much back to the world. And now, watching Daniel Cross bask in stolen glory, she clenched her fists. "This isn't right," Fiona said through gritted teeth. She wasn't alone. Keanu's motorcycle business partner, Ryder Kellen, slammed his coffee cup on the table. He trusted that guy with everything. But Keanu didn't rage. He didn't fume. Instead, he listened quietly to their outrage, his face unreadable. He thanked them for caring. He said he needed time. They wanted justice. They wanted him to fight. But Keanu wanted to understand. At night, Keanu sat alone in his living room, the fire crackling softly. He thought back over his life, the betrayals he'd endured. His father abandoning him at age 3, disappearing without a word. His best friend, River, lost to a drug overdose. Jennifer, his great love, and their baby, both taken too soon. And now Daniel, a brother in every way but blood, a man he trusted more than anyone. And he had been betrayed again. Keanu's quiet was not weakness. It was reflection. It was the kind of silence that came from being broken and still choosing not to break others. And then the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, no postmark, no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Daniel's? Keanu held the envelope in his hands for a long time before opening it. The letter was short. "Keanu, I had no choice. You'll understand one day. I'm sorry. Daniel." Keanu read it twice, then a third time. But the words didn't change. He set the letter down on the table, staring at it like it might explain itself. And for the first time in weeks, he let himself wonder, what if there was something more? Fiona didn't buy it. When Keanu showed her the letter, her reaction was immediate. "No choice? He stole your life's work." Keanu said nothing. But Fiona wasn't done. "I'm going to find out what he's hiding." Over the next several days, Fiona used her network of contacts, journalists, private investigators, insiders in the studio system. She worked quietly, behind the scenes, because Keanu wouldn't let her go public. "Not yet," he said. "Then let me do this," she replied. And she did. It didn't take long. Fiona uncovered records. Debt, massive debt. Daniel Cross owed millions to Iron Tower Studios. It had started with small loans, personal loans to fund short films, to cover living expenses between projects. But over time, Daniel's ambition outgrew his means. He took bigger loans. And Iron Tower had him exactly where they wanted him. When they found out about Shattered Light, they saw an opportunity. They pressured him, threatened to ruin him if he didn't sell them the script. And when he hesitated, they offered him everything he thought he wanted. Fame, control, freedom from debt, but at a price. And Daniel paid it, with Keanu's trust. Fiona shared the documents with Keanu in his kitchen. Keanu read them quietly, slowly, as if weighing each word. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Thank you." "That's it?" she asked, stunned. You're not angry?" Keanu shook his head. "I'm sad," he said simply. "Sad? Keanu, he's sold your story. He's sold you." "I know." Fiona threw her hands up. "So do something." But Keanu wasn't going to act out of revenge. He never did. Instead, he began crafting a plan. The world watched. More articles appeared. More interviews with Daniel. More rumors that Keanu was finished. Fans begged for him to fight back. Again. But, behind closed doors, Keanu met with old friends in the industry. Writers, directors, producers who still believed in something bigger than money. He met with independent studios. He met with Fiona and Ryder, and the people who had never betrayed him. And quietly, without fanfare, he began building something new. Not a lawsuit, not a smear campaign, but a project. One that would reveal the truth not by telling people, but by showing them. It was a different kind of justice, the kind only Keanu Reeves could deliver. Meanwhile, Daniel Cross celebrated his film's success. Shattered Light, the Iron Tower version, was slated to premiere at the Global Cinema Awards. Pre-leader buzz was huge. Daniel was the new star director in Hollywood. He gave interviews about his deeply personal journey. He smiled for the cameras, collected awards, and shook hands. But sometimes, late at night, he wondered when Keanu would come for him, and what that would look like. He expected lawsuits. He expected revenge. But there was nothing, and that worried him more. Back at Keanu's home, the fire burned low. He sat with Fiona, sketching storyboards in a journal. "It won't be big," he said. "It doesn't have to be," Fiona replied. "It just has to be real." He smiled softly, and when he did, something shifted. He was no longer hiding. He was no longer broken. He was ready. Keanu Reeves wasn't going to fight Daniel Cross. He was going to remind the world who he really was. And when he was finished, it wouldn't be Daniel's betrayal they remembered. It would be Keanu's response. A response that would leave everyone speechless. The sun was just rising over Los Angeles when Keanu Reeves slipped quietly into a small studio space on the city's east side. It wasn't glamorous. No marble floors, no press, no buzz of Hollywood deals. Just raw space, stripped down and quiet. And that was exactly what he wanted. He stood for a moment, breathing it in. This was where it would begin. Not revenge, not anger. Something better. For weeks, Keanu had been laying the groundwork for a new project, but this time, it wasn't just a film. It was a statement. One he would make in the only language he truly trusted: art. He'd spent sleepless nights sketching ideas in a leather notebook. Notebooks just like the one he'd once shared with Daniel Cross, back in the days when they were young and hopeful and building something together. But Daniel had sold that dream. Keanu would build a new one. And so, with quiet determination, Keanu brought together a team. Not the usual A-list producers or big studio names. He reached out to people who had been with him at his lowest, when the world wasn't watching. People like Fiona Carrington and Lucas Hall. Lucas was a scrappy indie director who had made his name telling small, human stories, raw, emotional stories, the kind Keanu loved. They had crossed paths years ago on a project that never made it to theaters, but the connection had stuck. Now, Lucas answered Keanu's call with a simple reply: "Whatever you need, I'm in." The team was small, but it was enough. Fiona handled logistics, calling in favors from friends she'd made during her years writing and advocating for truth. Lucas worked with Keanu on script revisions, breathing life into every word. But the heart of the story was Keanu's. It always had been. What the world didn't know was that before Shattered Light, there had been another script. A quieter one, a deeper one, Silent Horizon. He had written it years ago, long before the betrayal, before Hollywood had come calling with its contracts and promises. It was a story about loss, yes, but also about healing, about forgiveness, about hope. It was personal, too personal, he had once thought, but not anymore. Why this one? Lucas asked late one night as they sat in the empty studio, storyboards spread across a scarred wooden table. Keanu ran his fingers over the page, as if tracing something invisible. Because this is the one that tells the truth. Keanu funded the project himself. Every dollar. No investors, no studio backers, no compromises. He sold several of his motorcycles to help cover early costs, much to Ryder's dismay. "You could have just asked me," Ryder said, shaking his head. Keanu smiled faintly. "I had to do this with what I have." And so they worked in secret. A crew of 20. Shooting scenes in abandoned buildings, remote deserts, quiet forests. No trailers. No catering trucks. Just people telling a story. Word leaked eventually, as it always does. A whisper in the indie film circles. Keanu Reeves was making a movie. One, he wrote. One he was funding on his own. The press pounced. Keanu's comeback? Reeves goes rogue with indie project. Speculation ran wild. And at Iron Tower Studios, Daniel Cross was the first to hear about it. The news hit him like a wave. At first, he dismissed it. But when he learned the title, Silent Horizon, his hands trembled. He remembered that script. The one Keanu had written before Shattered Light. The one Daniel had told him was too quiet for today's audiences. And now Keanu was making it. Daniel's panic grew. What if Keanu's film exposed him? What if people compared the two stories and saw the truth? He tried to focus on his own film's release, but he found himself distracted. At night, he stared at his phone, scrolling through news stories about Keanu's quiet return. Then he did something he hadn't done in months. He called Keanu. The call came through late. Fiona glanced at Keanu as his phone buzzed on the table between them. He answered without hesitation. "Daniel." The voice on the other end was tight, controlled. "Can we meet?" Keanu said nothing for a moment. Then he replied softly, "Tomorrow, noon." He gave an address. A park they used to go to between auditions, back when their lives had been simpler. The next day, Keanu arrived early. He sat on a weathered bench beneath a massive oak tree, watching children play on the swings nearby. Daniel showed up on time. He looked tired, older than he had a few weeks earlier. His expensive suit didn't hide the strain in his face. For a moment, neither man spoke. Keanu broke the silence. "You wanted to talk." Daniel sat down, keeping a careful distance between them. "I heard about your film," Daniel said. Keanu nodded. "I'm not here to fight you," Daniel continued. "But I need to know, why now? Why this?" Keanu was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the leather bag beside him and pulled out a script. Silent Horizon. He handed it to Daniel. "This is what we should have made," Keanu said quietly. Daniel took the script, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it. The handwriting on the margins was familiar. Keanu's notes, edit, ideas they had shared once, long ago, before it all went wrong. "I thought it was too small," Daniel said after a moment. Keanu smiled faintly. "It's not small, it's real." Daniel looked at him, searching his face. "I didn't have a choice," he said again. "I know," Keanu replied. "I owed them everything," Daniel went on. "I was drowning. They offered me a way out." Keanu's gaze was steady. "And you took it." Daniel's shoulders sagged. "I did." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Keanu stood. "I'm not making this film to hurt you," he said. "Then why?" Daniel asked. "To tell the truth?" Keanu took a few steps away, then turned back. "You'll have to decide what to do with that." And then he walked away. Back at the studio, Keanu handed the final cut of Silent Horizon to Lucas. "Submit it," he said simply. Lucas didn't ask where. He already knew. The Independent Spirit Awards. The one place where small stories still mattered. The team gathered quietly that night to watch the finished film together. When the credits rolled, no one spoke. Fiona wiped her eyes. Lucas exhaled slowly. Keanu sat silently for a long time, staring at the screen. "It's good," Fiona whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly. "It's true." News of the film's submission reached the press within days, and with it, whispers of its raw power, its honesty. People talked. People wanted to see it, and slowly Silent Horizon became more than a project. It became a movement. Daniel watched it all from afar, and as he did, he realized something he hadn't expected. Keanu wasn't trying to beat him. He was trying to heal, and that left Daniel speechless. The lights of Los Angeles flickered against a deepening dusk as the world waited. The marquee of Iron Tower Studios gleamed under the weight of a heavily anticipated premiere, Shattered Light. The movie that had once been Keanu Reeves' dream now belonged to someone else. Daniel Cross's name was splashed across billboards, his interviews saturated the media, and the studio was already hailing him as the visionary of the decade. But inside Keanu's modest home on the other side of town, it was quiet. Fiona Carrington sat cross-legged on his worn couch, scrolling through the early critic reactions pouring in online. Her face was tight with tension. She looked up and found Keanu sitting at his small kitchen table, calmly pouring himself a cup of tea, the steam curling slowly into the cool air. "Do you want to know what they're saying?" Fiona asked softly. Keanu glanced at her with the faintest of smiles. "It's okay, I can imagine." But he already knew. The headlines had started only hours after Shattered Light premiered. Glossy but empty. A soulless shadow of a deeper story. Hollywood glitz can't save this hollow bloodbuster. And the most cutting of all, where is Keanu Reeves' voice? Despite its massive marketing push and high box office projections, the critics had been ruthless. It was a financial success, yes, but it was missing something. The heart. And everyone knew it. Daniel Cross had given them spectacle, but Keanu Reeves had held the soul. And tonight the world would see it. A week later, across town from the glitz of Hollywood, the Silver Ridge Independent Film Festival opened its doors. It wasn't Cannes, it wasn't Sundance, but it was honest, and that was enough. The marquee was simple. Silent Horizon, written, directed, and produced by Keanu Reeves. No flashing lights, no velvet ropes, no corporate sponsors. Fiona stood with Lucas Hall near the theater entrance as a small crowd gathered. "Do you think people will come?" Lucas whispered, adjusting his vintage blazer nervously. "They'll come," Fiona replied without hesitation. And they did. Word had spread through the indie circuits like wildfire. The rumors of Keanu's film had gone from quiet curiosity to fervent anticipation. Inside the theater, Keanu sat quietly in the back row, dressed in a plain black suit. He didn't want to be front and center. He never did. He just wanted the story to speak. As the lights dimmed and the first frames of Silent Horizon flickered on the screen, a hush settled over the room. The story unfolded slowly, like a sunrise over dark waters. It was tender, painful, hopeful. People in the audience wept openly. By the end of the film, when the final image faded to black, the silence was heavy with emotion. Then came the applause. Soft at first, then louder. A standing ovation. Keanu didn't move for a long time. Fiona had to nudge him. "Come on," she whispered. And so he stood and walked to the front of the theater as the audience cheered. What no one expected was who walked in just as Keanu reached the stage. Daniel Cross. He entered quietly through a side door, slipping into an empty seat near the back. His face was pale. He wore no suit this time, just a plain sweater and jeans. He sat in silence, watching Keanu stand there under the soft lights of a humble stage. Keanu took a deep breath. He looked at the crowd, the writers, artists, filmmakers, and fans who had come not because they were paid or pressured, but because they believed in stories. And then he spoke. "This story wasn't supposed to be mine alone," he began, his voice steady but soft. There wasn't a sound in the room beyond his words. It was built on trust, on shared dreams. But sometimes things fall apart. Sometimes the people you love, the people you trust, make choices you don't understand. Daniel closed his eyes, his throat tightening. Keanu continued. "I could have walked away. I could have fought. I could have shouted. But I've learned that silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's where the truth lives, where healing begins." He paused, glancing briefly toward the back of the theater. His eyes met Daniel's for just a moment. There was no anger in them, only understanding, and that made Daniel's hands tremble. "I made this film," Keanu said, turning back to the crowd, "because stories have power to wound, to heal, to remind us of who we are." He took another breath. "And because everyone deserves a second chance." There was a long silence after that. No one quite knew how to react. Then the applause came again, this time deeper, richer. Reporters swarmed him as he stepped off the stage. "Keanu, was this film a response to shattered light? Do you blame Daniel Cross? Are you going to take legal action?" The questions came fast and sharp, but Keanu only gave them a gentle, almost shy smile. "I forgive him," he said simply. "We all need second chances." That line was repeated across the world within hours. We all need second chances. It was on the front pages of entertainment magazines and splashed across social media, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. People were moved by Keanu's grace, his quiet strength, his refusal to be bitter. The world expected lawsuits. They expected vengeance. What they got was forgiveness, and it left them speechless. In the back of the theater, Daniel remained seated long after the crowd dispersed. Fiona stood nearby, watching him carefully. She had half a mind to tell him to leave, but she didn't. She just watched. Finally, Daniel stood and walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage, where Keanu remained. There was an awkward silence between them at first. Then Daniel spoke, his voice rough. "You could have destroyed me." Keanu looked at him with that same calm, unreadable expression. "I didn't want to." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You should have." He looked down at his feet. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I forgive myself." Keanu studied him for a long time. Then he extended his hand. "I meant what I said." Daniel stared at the hand as if it were a lifeline, and maybe it was. Slowly, he reached out and shook it. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered. "I know." Keanu's grip was firm but gentle. "Now do something good with what you've learned." The next morning, Silent Horizon was all over the news. Critics called it Keanu's masterpiece. "A raw, authentic triumph," one review read. "The kind of story that stays with you," wrote another. And the story of Keanu's forgiveness became the real headline. Not just the film, but the man behind it. The man who chose understanding over anger, compassion over revenge. Daniel gave no interviews after that night, but he quietly dissolved his contract with Iron Tower Studios. He declined their offers for future projects and took a long break from filmmaking altogether. Months later, he was spotted working at a small community arts center in a struggling neighborhood, teaching screenwriting to kids who had nothing but big dreams. People whispered that he'd finally found his real voice, the one he'd lost chasing success. Keanu declined offers from every major studio that begged to distribute Silent Horizon after its premiere. Instead, he worked with small indie theaters to keep the film intimate, authentic, true to what it was. When asked why, Keanu simply replied, "Because stories belong to the people, not to corporations." By the end of the year, Silent Horizon had quietly become one of the most impactful films of the decade. not because it broke box office records, but because it reminded people of something they had forgotten. The power of quiet leadership, the courage to forgive, and the hope that everyone, even those who fall, can rise again. As for Keanu, he returned to his quiet life, riding his motorcycle at sunrise, reading poetry in small cafes, visiting orphanages in Romania and cancer wards in Los Angeles, never asking for attention, just being Keanu. But for those who had seen Silent Horizon, and those who had witnessed his quiet courage, he had become something more, a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is forgive. The morning after the Silent Horizon premiere, the world woke up to something unexpected. Not a scandal, not an expose, but something different, something human. News outlets across the globe ran stories not just about Keanu Reeves' new film, but about what he had done, how he had chosen grace over vengeance, how he had met betrayal not with fury, but with forgiveness. Keanu Reeves' forgiveness leaves Hollywood in awe. Silent Horizon, the film and the man, changing everything. A masterclass in compassion. Everywhere people turned, there was Keanu's story, but not the version tabloids usually told. This wasn't about his quiet life or personal losses. It was about his choice. The choice to forgive his best friend when no one expected him to, when no one would have blamed him for doing the opposite. Within days, Silent Horizon had grown from an indie darling into a phenomenon. Critics couldn't stop talking about it. Audiences flooded theaters in cities across the United States and beyond. It wasn't just the film's storytelling that drew them in. It was the honesty behind it, the raw emotion, the vulnerability. At festivals in Europe, Silent Horizon won standing ovations that lasted for minutes. At one particular showing in Berlin, the applause reportedly went on for nearly 12 hours. The film swept awards at the Toronto International Film Festival, Sundance, and even Cannes, where it took home the coveted Palme d'Or. Not for special effects, not for flashy action sequences, but for something much rarer: truth. As the world celebrated Keanu's vision and resilience, Daniel Cross faced a storm of his own making. At first, the reaction was swift and brutal. Social media was ruthless. Hashtags like Daniel Cross Traitor and Justice for Keanu trended for days. Comment sections overflowed with anger. Former fans denounced him. Some demanded he be blacklisted from the industry. Some even called for legal action, even though Keanu had made it clear he wanted none. But something happened that no one expected. As people heard Keanu's words, "I forgive him. We all need second chances," something shifted. The tide of public opinion, once merciless, softened. It wasn't overnight, but it was real. People started asking a different question. What would make a man betray his best friend? And the answers, complicated and messy, came to light. Fiona Carrington, in a rare interview, helped explain it. Daniel's crushing debt, Iron Tower Studios' ruthless manipulation, the enormous pressure to succeed, and, most of all, Daniel's long-held belief that he wasn't enough in Keanu's shadow. It didn't justify what he'd done, but it helped people understand, and that was enough to make them pause. 1 week after Silent Horizon's global premiere, Daniel released a public apology. He didn't post it on social media or stage a press conference. Instead, he sent a handwritten letter to several publications. The same letter, written in his uneven handwriting. In it, he confessed everything: his betrayal, his regret, his shame. "I lost sight of who I was," he wrote, "and I lost the best friend I ever had. Keanu showed me mercy when I had shown him none. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that." It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And then Daniel disappeared. No more interviews. No more film deals. No more Daniel Cross sightings in Beverly Hills or Cannes. Some said he had moved to a small town on the coast of Oregon. Others claimed he was working in community theater under an alias. But Keanu knew where he was. Daniel had checked himself into a wellness retreat. Not the celebrity kind with spa treatments and paparazzi. A real one. He was trying to rebuild himself, peace, and Keanu let him. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves quietly returned to his life. He declined every interview, every late-night talk show, every exclusive magazine profile that promised to get his side of the story. He simply said, "The story has been told. I have nothing else to add." Instead, Keanu turned his focus elsewhere, to the thing that had always mattered more to him than fame or fortune: helping others. A month after Silent Horizons swept the festival circuit, Keanu made a small, unannounced appearance at an indie film school in New York. He gave a talk about storytelling, about truth, about why stories matter. And then, just as quietly, he announced the launch of the Silent Horizon Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting young, struggling filmmakers, especially those with personal stories to tell. Stories Hollywood often overlooked. Stories that didn't fit the mold. Stories that mattered. Keanu personally funded the foundation with the proceeds from Silent Horizon. He refused to take a salary. He refused to have his name plastered across the top of its website. "It's not about me," he told Fiona quietly one afternoon as they sat on a park bench overlooking the Los Angeles. It never was. The foundation started small. Grants for first-time filmmakers, mentorship programs, workshops on authentic storytelling. Within 6 months, it had grown into something much bigger. Studios started taking notice, not because they were pressured, but because the films coming out of the Silent Horizon Foundation were different. Fresh, genuine, unfiltered. Keanu personally mentored many of the young filmmakers, sometimes sitting in on their brainstorming sessions, sometimes working the camera himself on their small indie shoots. He never made it about him. He always made it about them. And as Silent Horizon made its quiet, unstoppable climb to cinematic immortality, Keanu Reeves became something more than a beloved actor. He became a symbol of quiet leadership, of integrity in a world obsessed with spectacle, of forgiveness when the world expected vengeance. Daniel Cross's betrayal had left a scar. There was no denying that. But Keanu's response left a legacy, one that outshone the betrayal, one that inspired millions, one that asked a question people still whispered in cafes, film schools, and boardrooms around the world. What if we chose grace instead of revenge? What if we forgave? By the end of the year, Silent Horizon was shortlisted for multiple Academy Awards. But Keanu refused to campaign. He skipped most of the glitzy award season parties. He spent that time volunteering at children's hospitals, visiting young cancer patients and reading them stories from his favorite books. When Silent Horizon eventually won Best Picture, Keanu sent Lucas Hall and a group of young filmmakers from the foundation to accept the award. He watched from home, with a quiet smile. One morning, months later, Fiona found Keanu sitting alone on the steps of a small theater, the same theater where Silent Horizon had premiered. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Keanu shrugged, his eyes thoughtful. How everything changes and stays the same. He glanced at her with a half smile. "I think it's time to write a new story." It didn't happen overnight. Change never does. But what Keanu Reeves did on that quiet night at the premiere of Silent Horizon set something in motion that no one could have predicted. It started small. A few young filmmakers, inspired by Keanu's story, spoke out about their own experiences, how they had been silenced, how their stories had been changed, twisted, watered down until they no longer recognized them, how they had walked away, believing that was just the cost of working in Hollywood. But after Silent Horizon, they began to speak up, and people listened. The story of Keanu's quiet forgiveness became something larger than just two men and a broken friendship. It became a symbol a symbol of integrity in an industry often accused of valuing profits over people. And it resonated in ways no one expected. Within months, major studios were holding public forums and private meetings about creator rights. Screenwriters who had once been anonymous were being invited to sit at the table. Directors were being encouraged to stay true to their original vision, even if it meant taking risks. And producers who had long built careers on controlling everything suddenly found themselves facing a new reality. The world was watching. The Keanu Reeves effect, as the press began to call it, wasn't about one man. It was about a movement. Industry veterans like Fiona Carrington lent their voices to the cause. Fiona, who had stood by Keanu when it all fell apart, now stood in front of rooms full of studio executives demanding better treatment for artists. She co-founded the Silent Horizon Coalition, a nonprofit organization that advocated for creative control, transparency, and fair treatment of filmmakers at every level. It wasn't long before smaller studios joined the movement. Then, surprisingly, the larger ones followed. It wasn't guilt or shame that drove them. It was fear of being left behind. And perhaps, just a little, the quiet pull of wanting to do something right. Pledges were made. Contracts were rewritten. New policies were introduced. Final cut approval for directors on personal projects. Guaranteed recognition for co-creators. Transparency clauses for financial decisions. What had once been a whispered, cynical truth about Hollywood, "That's just how it is," was suddenly under scrutiny. And people wanted change. It wasn't just industry insiders who took notice. Fans did, too. One morning in Los Angeles, Keanu's team received a photo from a passerby. It showed a mural painted on the side of an old brick building on Sunset Boulevard. A massive portrait of Keanu's face, his expression calm, his eyes thoughtful. Above him, in bold letters, "Silent strength." Below it, a simple quote, "Forgiveness doesn't change the past, it changes the future." No one knew who had painted it. Some said it was a local artist inspired by Silent Horizon. Others claimed it was an anonymous group of young filmmakers. But whoever they were, the message was clear. Keanu Reeves had become something more than an actor. He had become a symbol of quiet leadership in a noisy world. Months passed. Silent Horizon became required viewing in film schools across the country. Students wrote essays about its themes of redemption, healing, and the human need for connection. The Silent Horizon Foundation, now in its second year, had funded over 20 small films, most of them deeply personal stories that had once been deemed too risky for mainstream studios. But there was one story no one expected to hear again: Daniel Cross's. For almost 2 years, Daniel had vanished. Some said he was teaching acting workshops in small towns. Others believed he was working on a fishing boat somewhere off the coast of Maine. There were rumors that he had changed his name and walked away from filmmaking altogether. Then, quietly, a press release appeared on the website of the Venice Film Festival. A new documentary was scheduled to premiere in the small, intimate Sala Giardino Theater. The title was simple: Shattered Trust. The director? Daniel Cross. The description? An unflinching look at betrayal, loss, and the road to redemption. A personal story of failure and forgiveness, dedicated to Keanu Reeves. The news spread quickly. Speculation ran wild. Was this Daniel's apology? A public reckoning? A redemption tour? No one knew for sure. Not even Keanu. But on the night of the premiere, Keanu Reeves showed up in Venice. No entourage, no press, no announcement. He took a seat in the back row of the small theater, wearing a simple black jacket and jeans. Fiona Carrington sat beside him, her expression unreadable. The lights dimmed. The film began. For 90 minutes, the audience watched as Daniel Cross stripped himself bare on screen. There were no excuses, no clever editing, no attempts to soften the truth. Daniel told the story of his friendship with Keanu, how they had met on the set of an indie film when they were both young and hungry, how Keanu had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go, how they had dreamed together, and how Daniel had broken that dream. He spoke openly about the debt that had crushed him, about the threats from Iron Tower Studios, about the choices he made, and how, even when Keanu offered him forgiveness, he struggled to forgive himself. The documentary ended not with Daniel's triumph, but with his ongoing journey. A quiet scene of him sitting alone on a beach, writing in a journal. The waves crashing nearby. The title card appeared. Dedicated to those we hurt, and those who give us the chance to heal. Followed by, for Keanu. When the lights came up, there was silence. Not because people didn't know how to react, but because they understood they had just witnessed something rare. Honesty. Keanu stood slowly and walked to the front of the theater. Daniel, standing near the screen, turned and saw him. Their eyes met. No words were spoken. None were needed. Keanu gave a small nod. Daniel, his eyes red, returned it. The audience erupted into applause. Not for the film, not just for Daniel, but for the moment itself, for what it meant. Later that night, Keanu found Keanu sitting alone on the terrace of his hotel, overlooking the canals of Venice. "You didn't have to come," she said gently. "I know," he replied, "but I needed to." They sat in silence for a while, watching the lights dance on the water. "You think he'll be okay?" Fiona asked. Keanu shrugged. "He's trying. That's enough for now." She looked at him, studying his face. "You've changed a lot." Keanu smiled faintly. "No. I just stopped holding on to things that were too heavy." Shattered Trust went on to become one of the most talked about documentaries of the year. It wasn't universally praised. Some critics accused it of self-indulgence, but others saw it for what it was: a man's attempt to make amends. Daniel never returned to big studio filmmaking. He spent the next several years working with nonprofit film collectives, helping at-risk youth tell their own stories through film. He never asked Keanu for anything. But Keanu watched from a distance, quietly supporting the grants that funded Daniel's workshops. By the third anniversary of Silent Horizon's release, the movement Keanu had sparked was still growing. Studios across the globe had adopted the Silent Horizon standard, a set of guidelines protecting creative integrity. It became an industry benchmark, and those who didn't comply found themselves left behind. The mural of Keanu on Sunset Boulevard became a landmark. Tourists posed in front of it. Filmmakers gathered there at sunset, often leaving notes and flowers beneath it. Notes that said things like, "Thank you for giving us a voice. Silent strength changed my life." Keanu never visited the mural, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he didn't need to. He spent his days working on small films, mentoring new storytellers, and continuing his humanitarian efforts quietly. Sometimes Fiona would find him at the small community theater in Los Angeles, helping build sets or working lights for a production no one outside the neighborhood had heard of. And Keanu was perfectly content. One evening, as they walked together through the old theater where it all began, Fiona asked him, "Do you ever wish it had happened differently, that Daniel hadn't betrayed you?" Keanu paused, considering. "No," he said softly, "because we wouldn't be here if it hadn't." And she knew he meant it. Years passed. Hollywood moved on, as it always did. New stars rose, new films shattered box office records, and new scandals played out in public. But quietly, beneath the surface, something had changed. And for those who'd paid attention, it was clear where the shift had begun. Keanu Reeves had become a legend, not because of another action franchise or a billion-dollar blockbuster, but because of what he chose not to do. He had built something lasting from the ashes of betrayal, a legacy not of revenge, but of forgiveness. And yet, if you asked him, he would simply shrug it off. "I just did what made sense," he might say, his eyes thoughtful, his voice calm. But those who knew him, those who had walked beside him through the storm, understood it was something more. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, Keanu arrived early at the small community theater on the east side of Los Angeles. The building was old, its paint peeling in places, the wood stage creaking underfoot. But Keanu loved it here. It was honest. It was real. He parked his motorcycle outside, the familiar growl of its engine echoing off the brick walls. Then, helmet in hand, he walked inside. A group of young actors, wide-eyed and eager, sat in a semicircle on the stage. Some were in their teens, others in their early 20s. Most of them had never been in front of a camera before. But here, none of that mattered. Keanu smiled as he set down his bag and joined them. They greeted him with a mixture of reverence and genuine affection. He was their teacher, their mentor, not the movie star they had grown up watching. Here, he was simply Keanu. Their sessions weren't about becoming famous. Keanu taught them to find truth in their performances, to listen, to feel, to be present. Sometimes they spent hours on a single line of dialogue. Other times they sat in silence, just breathing, learning how to hold space for each other. And they trusted him, because he never pretended to be perfect. He shared his mistakes, his regrets, his failures as freely as his successes. Acting, he told them one afternoon, isn't about pretending, it's about remembering who we are when we're not pretending anymore. One of his students, a soft-spoken young man named Diego, asked him once, "Do you ever miss it? The big movies, the red carpets?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But this," he gestured around the old theater, at the young actors listening intently. "This is where I'm supposed to be now." Meanwhile, the world continued to tell his story. Fiona Carrington, the journalist who had stood by him through the darkest days of the betrayal, had spent 2 years writing a book. It was released quietly, without much fanfare. But word spread fast. The title was simple but powerful. Silent Horizon, Keanu Reeves and the Power of Forgiveness. It climbed the bestseller lists within weeks, not because it was salacious or scandalous, but because it told the truth. Fiona had written about Keanu's decision not to fight back, not to destroy Daniel Cross. She wrote about the strength it took to choose a different path, and about how that choice had changed everything, not just for him, but for an entire generation of artists. Critics called it one of the most important books of the decade. Readers flooded Fiona with letters, thanking her for telling a story that wasn't about revenge, but about healing. And Keanu? He read the book once, quietly, late at night in his small home. He called Fiona the next morning. "Thank you," he said. And that was all. Movie offers continued to come, of course. Directors begged him to headline new blockbusters. Studios offered him creative control, massive paydays, anything to get him back. But he politely declined every time. Instead, he focused on his small projects, documentaries about unsung heroes, short films exploring the quiet moments of life. He worked with first-time directors, often funding their projects himself and never asking for credit. And he kept teaching, every week at the community theater. He was there when the lights came on in the morning and when they flickered off at night. One afternoon, years later, Fiona visited him after class. They sat together in the small lobby, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. "You could have had everything," she said softly. "The studios, the power, the fame." Keanu chuckled. "I have everything I need." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to read something deeper in his expression. And maybe she did. Or maybe she was just proud. The world continued to celebrate him in ways he never sought out. The mural on Sunset Boulevard had become a pilgrimage site for young filmmakers and actors. Every year, on the anniversary of Silent Horizon, they gathered there with candles and flowers. Some left notes, thanking him for giving them hope. Others simply sat in silence, reflecting on what his story meant to them. Keanu never attended those gatherings. He didn't need to. The impact was already there. He had done what he set out to do. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Keanu did what he always did when he needed time to think. He got on his motorcycle and rode. The streets of Los Angeles faded behind him. The mountains rose ahead, bathed in golden light. The wind rushed past him, carrying away everything that didn't matter. He didn't have a destination in mind. He rarely did. It wasn't about where he was going. It was about the ride itself. At the top of a quiet hill, he pulled over and sat down beside his bike. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, the last light of day fading into twilight. He breathed deeply, and he smiled. He thought about Daniel, about the young man he had met on that indie film set so many years ago, about the betrayal, about the forgiveness, and about what came after. He thought about Fiona, about her unwavering support, about her book, now read by millions, about the countless lives she had touched by telling his story. He thought about the students at the theater, about Diego, now a promising playwright, about Mia, whose short film had just won an award, about all the young dreamers who had found a home in the place he had built for them. And he thought about himself, where he had been, what he had lost, what he had gained. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He was grateful for all of it, for the journey that had brought him here, for the chance to be something more than what the world expected, for the legacy he had chosen to leave. Not one of revenge, but of forgiveness, of quiet leadership, of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. As the last light disappeared and stars dotted the sky, Keanu stood, put on his helmet, and swung a leg over his bike. The engine roared softly to life, and he rode off into the night, a lone figure on a quiet road, carrying with him the simple truth that had guided his life, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is forgive, and sometimes the greatest legacy is the one you build when no one is watching. Keanu Reeves' journey wasn't about the betrayal. It wasn't about the scandal that rocked an industry or the headlines that splashed his name across every newsfeed. It wasn't even about his stunning comeback with Silent Horizon. It was about something far quieter, something far more difficult. Forgiveness? At a time when the world expected him to retaliate, to unleash the full power of his influence and destroy the man who had wronged him, Keanu chose another path. He chose to understand, to reflect, to rise above. And in doing so, he reminded us of something we often forget, that true strength doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like letting go, and in letting go, creating space for something new. There's a lesson in Keanu's story, one that isn't easy to hear and even harder to live. We are taught to fight back when we're wronged, to defend ourselves, to take back what was stolen. We're told that justice means evening the score, but Keanu showed the world another kind of justice, a justice that comes from healing, a justice that doesn't depend on punishment or public shaming. Instead, it's the quiet justice of knowing who you are and refusing to let someone else's choices change that. When Daniel Cross betrayed Keanu, it would have been easy to burn bridges, to launch lawsuits, to make headlines, and maybe, in some people's eyes, he would have been justified. But Keanu knew something deeper. That betrayal only has power over us if we hold on to it. That revenge can feel satisfying for a moment, but it often leaves us emptier than before. He didn't deny the pain. He didn't pretend it didn't hurt. But he also didn't let it define him. Keanu's legacy isn't the films he made. It isn't the awards he won or the records he broke. It's the lives he changed by being an example of quiet strength. He chose to mentor young actors instead of chasing another blockbuster. He chose to fund struggling filmmakers instead of launching legal battles. He chose to forgive someone who had taken almost everything from him, and in doing so, he gained something even more valuable: peace, purpose, freedom. And that choice? It rippled out farther than anyone could have imagined. Silent Horizon wasn't just a movie. It was a message, one that told people that hope is always stronger than fear, that compassion can outlast betrayal, that forgiveness can be the beginning of something extraordinary. Studios began to change their contracts, offering more protection for creators. Filmmakers told their own stories of betrayal and of healing. And people everywhere began to ask, what would happen if we let go of anger, What could we create in its place? Keanu never spoke much about it. He didn't give long interviews or dramatic speeches. He didn't write a tell-all memoir. But if you listened closely, you could hear it in the way he spoke to his students, in the way he smiled when someone thanked him for Silent Horizon, in the quiet way he rode his motorcycle through the city at dusk, content with his choices. He didn't need to explain. His life was the explanation. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the strongest response isn't revenge. It's understanding. It's the ability to see past the hurt, past the betrayal, and into the truth that we are all human. We all make mistakes. And sometimes offering forgiveness is how we free ourselves. So here's a question for you. Have you ever witnessed quiet forgiveness like Keanu's? Maybe it was a friend who forgave something you thought was unforgivable. Maybe it was you who chose to walk away from anger and towards something better. We'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, because every story of forgiveness helps someone else believe it's possible. And if this incredible story of Keanu Reeves touched your heart, if you believe that forgiveness is stronger than revenge, then please like this video, share Keanu's incredible story, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Because the world needs more reminders that there's another way, a better way. Keanu Reeves showed us that way, not with a grand gesture, not with a headline-grabbing announcement, but with quiet strength and quiet forgiveness. And sometimes, that's the most powerful message of all.